bit of a different tack, perhaps, on how I see hydrogen coming into Australia, and how I see Australia really building a good reputation globally as being an absolute powerhouse within the hydrogen industry. And I certainly agree with all of the speakers so far in the general session that our potential around export and mobility and all the things that we can do is absolutely critical as part of that. But I guess I look at it a little bit more from a domestic standpoint, and how do we domestically get our heads around using this source to allow our country to sort of maintain its place and build its place globally. So I'm talking today about hydrogen-based standalone power systems, and I'll talk a little bit about how that sort of comes through. Is my screen all there all right, Paul?
We can see your first slide.
Yeah, looks good to me, Craig.
All right, good. Okay, thank you. So look, I think there's no argument from everyone here that the world is potentially a little broken when it comes to the environment, and I think that we all it's incumbent on all of us in our roles to be fiscally responsible in how we go about sort of repairing that and doing that. And certainly the government is taking on its role to help us go through that process and bring this hydrogen technology to the world and get it to scale where it makes sense. The challenge we do have is the technology is expensive, as been discussed already. And what happens with that, potentially, is that the movement is very slow, and we're seeing that. The forecasts are not that far away. It is closer than it's ever been. But we don't necessarily get fast traction, and the the environment continues to go into a bit of a nerve-wracking future. But where I see, I guess, solutions to that now and maintaining that fiscal responsibility is using hydrogen in standalone power systems, which are becoming quite prevalent in many places. Powering remote Australia is hard. We've got an incredibly harsh and spread geography where getting things around the place is complex, it's costly, and it's certainly risky. We get it done because we're good at adapting, surviving, and I think through the decades and centuries in Australia, we've been good at solving the challenges of our community, of our country. But not all of the outcomes, I guess, are ideal, and the environment certainly does come out second place when it comes to solving those challenges. That being said, it's really important that we do have solutions to challenges. We've got a very vastly spread population, either living as a community or operating as a commercial venture. And it's been really important that we've found ways to solve their energy needs, being such a basic need for people to exist. And here's some examples of three sort of large energy providers in Australia who have done a great job over the years developing standalone power systems and microgrids for remote communities and remote businesses. So it's there, it's all very good, but it comes at a cost. Certainly environmentally it comes at a cost, but also it comes at a cost in terms of the subsidies that the government provides to ensure that the power is affordable for all. And it certainly comes at a cost as well in the cost of the fuel, being typically diesel. To add to those challenges from a remote standpoint, you also have a rural standpoint. It's estimated that there's more than 20,000 customers who live on the fringe of the grids. And the fringe of the grids are challenging too, because you've got long lines heading out, sometimes hundreds of kilometres, to support communities or businesses with energy. Very costly to maintain, very costly to install, and reliability can certainly be challenged in recent devastating times of bushfires, but also when just natural events happen and lines can go down. So that's certainly a big challenge on the one side. The other challenge I think that we face is more on the commercial side, the mining, agriculture, aquaculture businesses around Australia that are operating their own private grids. They're very important to have those grids, and the commercial ventures are critical to our nation. However, it's costly, both once again on the financial side and also on the environmental side. And to put it in perspective, if you look at Newcrest Mining's annual report, their global use of diesel to generate energy was just under 9 million gigawatts of energy was used just from coming from diesel alone. So when we think about the diesel and the pollutants from that, it's a pretty bad outcome, critical for their business and critical for our world to get to where it's gotten to, but it's not a position that we need to stand at and want to stand at forever. So what we see with my partners is that hydrogen really can solve these problems today. And that's where the domestic sort of points come in. Using localized production and storage through solar and wind sometimes, you do actually have a lower levelized cost of energy than diesel using these processes. And it allows us to then use renewable energy 24/7, 365 days of the year. And that's certainly important, and we've seen that through earlier presentations, but hydrogen really can position us to move forward and domestically use that to become part of our strength. So how does hydrogen solve these challenges in a standalone power system? I guess the first strength that hydrogen has that can support that is its density. We all know about the dense energy medium that it is, and where you are in remote areas that aren't particularly struggling for space, there's no limit to how much you can generate and store, which allows these places to get through the night or seasons of low sun. The equipment goes for decades, so it gives you that sort of large ability to support large power needs as you go. Hydrogen, getting diesel and LPG around, which is sort of the more common fuel that's used today in these remote locations, it's not particularly hard. Logistics, we've been doing it for a long time, but all sorts of weather events, monsoons can cause challenges, mechanical failures of trucks to move things around. It's challenging. And having a hydrogen-based standalone power system can allow you to remove that logistic sort of nightmare and supply things locally. A hydrogen-based SAP can actually have a lower levelized cost of energy than diesel. When diesel's at around $1.40 as it is at the local city pumps, it may be not quite so easy, but there are parts of Australia where they're paying beyond $5 a litre of diesel. And certainly when you're matching up against that sort of cost, hydrogen can certainly be very, very competitive and cheaper to run. It does fix the cost of energy. Perhaps not necessarily so important on the individual side, although we all do worry about the cost of energy going up and up each year. But certainly from a business point of view and running a P&L, being able to forecast and know what your energy costs will be for the next 20 years can certainly be a benefit. It provides reliable local power. When I read about some of the work that the energy companies have been doing with their standalone power systems, moving communities into localized solutions gives them so much more reliability than they've never had, which certainly helps their businesses as well. But it's an important resource, energy, and making it reliable is pretty critical. Hydrogen can certainly scale with growth. Rather than having to necessarily forecast what your energy need might be in 5 or 10 years and build a generation system accordingly, hydrogen's quite modular. The electrolyzers and fuel cells are quite modular, and therefore they're able to be scaled as necessary to make sure that as the needs grow, you can grow the provision of energy without any sort of real negative impact on a financial side. They're easy to install. I think pretty much every manufacturer of electrolyzers and the likes build their systems into containers. They're typically specified and put together at the point of manufacture, and they can then be trucked and installed by competent technicians accordingly as it needs to be done. So very easy to install and therefore very suitable for remote areas. And finally, they integrate well with current systems. Often there's obviously a challenge around legacy generation devices and the need to manage the costs of provision and assets that might be sort of slowly working down their value. Being able to integrate a hydrogen-based system slowly as assets turn over and generate is certainly pretty attractive for people. So hydrogen from a standalone power system does give you all of these things, all with zero harmful emissions. So it starts to look pretty attractive. So how do it look at a very basic level? What you see here is, I guess, a typical setup that they've where you've got your renewable generation, typically solar, but it can be wind, feeding into the energy need, whether it be a factory or a house or anything else. And then, but also it's feeding into an electrolyzer to store that energy in hydrogen for later use and off-peak times, being at lack of wind or lack of sun. So it's a fairly simple process, and it all can sit alongside what's going on. When you're actually building up the system, you work in reverse, hence the numbers working backwards there. We look at what is the demand profile of the energy that's being used, what time of day is it being used, how much is being used in off-peak times, and that allows us to then look at what sort of fuel cells required for energy provision, but also therefore how much hydrogen needs to be generated to allow that support 24/7 throughout the year. So then you can size your solar generation or wind generation appropriately. That basically allows you to then feed the resource directly, which is the most efficient through the days and the windy periods, but also store enough energy for the off-peak and non-attractive sort of processes. At a more sort of specific level, it looks a bit more like this. So you can see there's a town there, or it could be a community, a factory, it could be anything really, but you can see the solar panels of the solar farm is off-site, outside of the community, set up to supply the energy that's needed during the day, with excess going into the containerized hardware of electrolysis and fuel cells to supply the community in the non-peak periods. Those solar panels could also sit on side of the roofs, of course, so you maximize your space and utilization of what you've got to ensure it's most effective. So what are the barriers? And I think this is the big question for me that I look at on a regular basis. If hydrogen is viable today in rural and remote mining agricultural sort of scenarios, how do we get it to gain more traction? And that's the big question that sort of keeps me awake at night. I think one of the first things is awareness and education. Education was talked earlier about in terms of the social license to use hydrogen. There's a lot of fear about hydrogen. There's a lot of unknowns for a lot of the population about the dangers around hydrogen. I certainly agree from some of the earlier speakers that we've been working with this gas for quite a long time. We know a lot about how to manage it very safely, but educating people on that is pretty important. Obviously, also the awareness. I think the general conversation today is really about domestic export and mobility use of hydrogen, and I don't get the sense that people sort of are aware that it could really even work and is working in other parts of the world in a standalone power system type scenario. So awareness of that, I think, will certainly help it gain more traction in Australia. I think more focus on domestic and stationary use certainly helps as well. As I was saying, the discussion in the papers or the articles, everything else is very high on export for Australia, which I think is obviously very critical for us as a future nation and our export revenues. And of course, that needs to start now so it can happen now, but really focusing on the domestic use of hydrogen and how we can use it effectively will certainly help us become that sort of superpower in the hydrogen status and having it used more regularly. Managing the risk appetite. Everyone has a risk sort of care, a level of care around risk and how we want to do it. And I think it's really looking at how do we bring this technology in and make sure we don't leave ourselves or our clients or our customers at risk in terms of not having the power that's required. So it's really about trying to find opportunities to use it until we get very comfortable with it that doesn't allow risk. For example, where you've got perhaps a large mine that has an accommodation block and a current diesel generation sort of capacity, you might be able to take the accommodation blocks off the diesel and onto a hydrogen solution, but one where you can flick the switch if you need to because something doesn't quite work like it should have. So certainly finding a way to do that is very important. Looking at fringe opportunities, one of the things that I guess I find interesting, but also I look at from an objective point of view when I look at my business, is all of the great data and research that's been done around hydrogen and the cost of hydrogen. It's all very real, but like everything, is aggregated, and where you've got aggregation, you've got fringes where it does make sense today. And I think we need to look for those opportunities in a very proactive manner, because they're there, and we can certainly start moving that direction very much today. I do believe we should have some proactive focus on remote issues. Generally with technology and for lots of reasons, it's focused on, I guess, the more urban areas and areas of population. Here we've got a technology that can really benefit not only the country and what we do with our environment, but also the people that live in the remote parts of the world and work in the remote parts of the world. So I think, once again, proactively focusing on how we better support the remote parts of our country can help us gain more traction in these areas as well. Trusting non-local experience. So it's one of those things, that non-invented here syndrome, and it's not unique to Australia, it's not unique to any individuals, but we always do have a bit of a concern and a worry about things that aren't done here, and will it work in Australia or not. And I think there are a number of examples overseas in Northern Europe and Southern Europe where they are doing this kind of thing. And maybe not now with the issues around COVID, but down the track, jumping on a plane and going and seeing how they're being used can certainly help us get more comfort and move our way forward on this. And finding to get more traction, I guess it is a financial model issue as well. The technology is expensive, and therefore the asset capital outlay to get started certainly can be challenging. And I believe the way around that is finding ways to be creative at how we sort of pay for these things and get the assets in place. There's some great parallels of companies that have created different models to get solar panels onto community roofs in a very cost-effective win-win manner. And I believe if we think carefully about the standalone power systems and hydrogen, we can find clever ways to do that as well. So in conclusion, hydrogen-based standalone power systems, to me, they certainly are viable and can work up a number of situations where we can see that happening. To place diesel and replace that cost of diesel, but also the negative environmental impact of diesel. They're very beneficial, both commercially and environmentally, and I think that's what we're all trying to achieve with the hydrogen story. And finally, they are able to de-risk energy supply for our remote and rural businesses and communities, and I think that's once again a very important thing to do and move forward to, particularly given we can do it in a very commercially effective way. Thank you for your time. I appreciate your willingness to listen to what we're talking about, and once again, everyone being so interested in the hydrogen story is really encouraging and exciting for our future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. That's fantastic. I think there's a lot of potential given the economic factors of the remote power systems and using hydrogen, and particularly displacing diesel, which is expensive and particularly expensive to get to remote locations. I'll ask, there's been a few questions, so I might ask one, and I might ask you if you could go on to the Q&A function and engage with the audience on some of the questions. But one of the questions was about remote areas often face water shortages. And so in terms of particularly renewable hydrogen, are you seeing ways that people are potentially looking at creating hydrogen, maybe using other sources of water or other technologies?
Yeah, probably the easiest way to talk about that is in terms of the efficiency or the complete loss. It's a circular loop. So if you think about a container where you've got an electrolyzer and a fuel cell inside, yes, you're using water to make the hydrogen, but when you recombine it back into energy, you're making water, and you can collect that water and you can cycle it back into the tanks where you're drawing off with the electrolyzer. You've got about a 3% loss of water through the process. So there is a need to top that up at some point in time. But to put it in perspective, I've looked at an office here in Melbourne of about 100 people, and the circular loss of water in that process was about 1 litre per day of water to lose. you could literally in a very remote area find waste grey water and clean it up and use that to top it up as opposed to using fresh new water.
Fantastic. Thanks, Craig. I think that's actually one of the things in the public education, the use of water and renewable hydrogen, because we obviously use water in a lot of other energy sources currently. And there's a lot of wasted water, as you mentioned, across a whole range of sectors. So, and the amount to split to create hydrogen out of water is not necessarily a lot of water either. So yeah, that's been great. Look, if you could pop onto the Q&A forum, I think that worked really well with Karen last time. I think he almost engaged in a bit of an online chat with some people there. So if you could do that, Craig, that'd be awesome. And we'll stick to time, and I'll thank you for that.